Full and authentic account of the Whitechapel Murders. Never in the record of criminal history were the police of any country called upon to unravel a mystery so complete as that which enshrouds the famous murders in Whitechapel, London. 9 victims have fallen under the skilful knife of an unknown fiend, and there remains not a particle of a clue on which to hang a hope of discovery of the murderer. From beginning to end, the tragedies have been marked by many circumstances and mysterious details, which fill all with horror and dismay. The clubman in his club, the lady in her boudoir, the housewife in her kitchen, the working girl in the shop and factory, the whispering, gin-soaked public woman on the thoroughfare, alike were stirred by these dreadful tidings of heartless and bloody crime. The government of Her Majesty was questioned about them in open Parliament. The detectives of Scotland Yard put their heads together, plotted, schemed, devised, but all to no purpose. The ensanguined book of dastardly murder is a sealed book. One after the other, the mutilated victims of this mysterious demon were picked up on the highways of a great city, but no one has seen the murderer. No one suspects who he is, and no one has found him. A great wave of nervous, feverish alarm and terror swept over the metropolis of Great Britain. In every case the unmistakable work of the same fiend was too painfully apparent to admit of a doubt that these murders in Whitechapel were wrought by one fell hand. Madman he probably was, but with all his boldness he possessed a cruel cunning which allowed him to stalk abroad on the public streets, striking down his victims as he pleased, leaving not the faintest clue to his personality. No conception can be formed of the motives of his horrible crimes, unless it is reasonable to suppose it was the work of a maniac. Did the fiend experiment on the corpses for anatomical purposes? Did he seek revenge on the class of public women because some injury he had himself received from one of them? Was he a madman, irresponsible, bloodthirsty, craving supernatural excitements? These are some of the questions that may resolve themselves when you have read a detailed account of these murders perpetuated in one of the oldest, and presumably one of the most civilized cities in the modern world. The first of the Whitechapel murder series attracted little public attention. It was perpetrated on April 3, 1888. The victim was Emma Elizabeth Smith. As the policeman stooped over her, looked into her bloodless face, in the light of bull's-eye, gazed into her blear eyes, smelt her gin-soaked breath, examined her blood-stained clothes, he reported the case to headquarters. The officials did not bother much about it. Only a woman of the lowest class, they thought, murdered in a drunken brawl. What else can you expect in Whitechapel, with its floating population of criminals and fallen women? The press commented a little on the incident. The clubman yawned after he read about it at his supper. The fine lady remarked it was shocking as she buttered her muffins at breakfast, and then the disagreeable subject was dismissed. Martha Turner was a poor hawker in Whitechapel. On Tuesday, August 7, 1888, this Martha Turner was found lying on her back, her clothing disarrayed, on the first-floor landing of the buildings known as George Yard Buildings, Commercial Street, Spitalfields, Whitechapel. Her throat was cut, her breasts were amputated and laid beside her, her legs were lacerated with knife gashes, and the blood stained the floor with clotted red. The day previous to the second murder had been what is known as Bank Holiday, and it was late in the evening that day that the murder had been perpetrated. Martha Turner had evidently met her fate by the same hand that struck down Emma Elizabeth Smith. The same mutilation of the same parts was visible. The same rapid work was traceable in the assassin's onslaught. As nearly as the police could determine, both women had been seized suddenly, unexpectedly, by a powerful arm from behind, and their throats cut swiftly by the rapid stroke of a razor-edged knife. Such was the force of the murderer's death blow and such the keenness of his devilish weapon that the head was almost severed from the body, hung loose, and the knife had left its imprint upon the bone at the back of the neck. But more remarkable than the ghastly work at the throat was the discovery that the woman had received no less than 39 distinct, deep and clear cut stabs upon various parts of her body. From these wounds the blood had poured forth, saturating her clothes and covering the steps on which she lay with a slippery coating of coagulated blood. Examination of the body revealed the same horrible, indescribable mutilation of the uterus that had marked the first murder. The underclothing of coarse material had been thrown roughly up over the victim's head, and a jagged wound crossed the bowels, laying bare the intestines. Below this a portion of the woman's body had been cut out with the nicety and skill of a surgeon's knife, leaving only a blood-oozing and quivering aperture. The organ had been removed, as in the case of the first murder. Horror seized the police authorities on seeing this sight. Several friends of the victim were arrested and held by the coroner. But little was found that cast light on the crime. At the inquest, Mary Ann Connolly, known in Whitechapel as Pearly Poll, was a witness, who was expected to give valuable information. Inspector Reed asked that she might be cautioned prior to being sworn, and the coroner complied with this request. "I am a single woman," testified Pearly Poll. "I've been lodging in a lodging house in Dorset Street. I have gained my livelihood on the streets. I've known the murdered woman for 4 or 5 months. We called her Emma. The last time I saw her alive was on Bank Holiday, at the corner of George Yard, Whitechapel. We went to a public house together and parted at 11:45. We were accompanied by 2 soldiers, one a private and one a corporal. I don't know to what regiment they belonged, but they had little white bands around their caps. I don't remember whether the corporal had side arms or not. We picked up with the soldiers together and entered several public houses. We drank at each of the houses. When we separated, Emma went away with the private. They went up to George Yard, and I and my fellow went to Angel Alley. Before I went away from my fellow I had a quarrel, and he hit me with a stick. I didn't hear Emma have a quarrel. I never saw her alive again. Emma wasn't given to drink. I tried to pick out the 2 men who were with us. I tried at Wellington Barracks. The men were paraded before me, but though I saw 2 men something like those who were with us on the night of the murder, I couldn't be sure. I left my fellow, the corporal, at 5 or 10 minutes past 12 that morning, and afterwards went along Commercial Street towards Whitechapel. I didn't hear no screams. I didn't hear of the murder till Tuesday." Pearly Poll was the only witness who could give any news at all about Martha Turner, and that news, as you see, was scant enough. The authorities were baffled. The public was beginning to be aroused. Scarcely had aristocratic West End of London recovered from the second murder in low-life East End when the city and the world were cast into new spasms by the flash of news that a third crime had been committed in the cursed, crime-stained precincts of Whitechapel. Everybody asked, "Who is it?" And the answer came swifter than death, "Another woman." This time it was Mary Ann Nichols, aged 42, a woman of the lowest class. She had been killed and mutilated. Her body was found in the street in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, in the early morning of Friday, August 31st. Mary Ann Nichols had evidently not been killed on the spot where her body lay dead. She had evidently been killed at another spot and dragged to where she lay. There was little blood around the corpse. Bucks Row is a short street, half occupied by factories, half by dwelling houses. Half down this street is the house of Mrs. Green. Next to this house is a large stable yard, whose wide, closed gateway is next to the house. In front of the gateway Mary Ann Nichols was found. The brutality of the murder is beyond conception and beyond description. The throat was cut in 2 gashes, the instrument of crime having been a sharp one, but used in a most ferocious and reckless way. There was a gash under the left ear, reaching nearly to the center of the throat. Along half its length, however, it was accompanied by another one, which reached around under the other ear, making a wide and horrible hole and nearly severing the head from the body. No murder was ever more ferociously or more brutally done. The knife, which must have been a large and sharp one, was jabbed into the deceased at the lower part of the abdomen, and then drawn upward twice. A sickening sight, truly, such as unmanned the most hardened official. Constable O'Neill, who discovered the lifeless body, immediately rapped at the house of Mrs. Green. "Have you heard any unusual noise?" he asked, wiping the perspiration from his brow. Then he pointed out the body. Mrs. Green almost fainted when she saw the ghastly spectacle. Constable O'Neill put his hand on the woman's shoulder and repeated the question. Mrs. Green, as though demented, shook her head in the negative. Then Constable O'Neill questioned the son and daughter of Mrs. Green. "We have heard no outcry," said they. "The night was unusually quiet," said Mrs. Green finally. "I should have heard a noise, if there had been any, for I have trouble with my heart and am a very light sleeper." Then Constable O'Neill questioned Mr. Perkins, an opposite neighbor to the Greens, but he also denied having heard a noise in the still air of night. Several people, however, remembered strange sounds. "I was awakened Friday morning," testified Mrs. Perkins, a neighbor, "by my little girl, who said someone was trying to get into the house. I listened and heard screams. They were in a woman's voice, and though frightened, were faint-like, as would be natural if she was running. She was screaming, 'Murder! Police! Murder!' She seemed to be all alone. I think I would have heard the steps if anybody had been running after her, unless he were running on tiptoe." The detectives of Scotland Yard, thoroughly aroused by this third murder, at once searched everywhere in the vicinity, in the hope of discovering some clue. None was found. Everything pointed to the fact that the murder was committed at some distance from where the body lay. There were drops of blood all along the sidewalks. But there was a mystery even here. The police were puzzled by the fact that there were bloodstains on both sides of the street. Amid a gaping, terror-stricken crowd, the blood-clotted body of Mary Ann Nichols was lifted on a stretcher and conveyed to the death house. A cordon of police had to keep the crowd back. It took some time to identify her positively. The clothing wore a workhouse stamp. A comb and a piece of looking-glass were found in one of the pockets. Finally, 4 women identified her, said they knew her by the name of Polly. "We have lived with her at 18 Thrall Street, Spitalfields," said they. "We lived there in a room. We paid 4d. a night." On the night of the murder, it appears Mary Ann Nichols, alias Polly, was turned out of this house because she hadn't money to pay for her lodgings. She was then a little the worse for drink, and said, as she was turned away, "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." The lodging-house people only knew her as Polly, but later a woman from Lambeth Workhouse identified her as Mary Ann Nichols. The deceased woman had been an inmate of the workhouse, and left it to take a situation as a servant. But after a short time she absconded with £3 of her employer's money. From that time forth she was an outcast. The police theory was, at the time, that a sort of high-rip gang existed in the neighbourhood, which, blackmailing women of the unfortunate class, takes vengeance on those who do not find money for them. They based that surmise on the fact that within 12 months 2 other women have been murdered in the district by almost similar means, one as recently as the 6th of August last, and left in the gutter of the street in the early hours of the morning. At the coroner's inquest no testimony was adduced that tended to cast any light on the horrible mystery. The deceased woman's husband, who was a printer's machinist, testified that he had lived apart from his wife for over 8 years, and the last time he saw her alive was 3 years ago. His wife had left him of her own accord, and her drinking habits had led her into a dissolute life. A week after the killing of Mary Ann Nichols, another fallen woman, Annie Chapman, aged 45, was found killed and hacked like the rest, this making the fourth murder. Her body was discovered in Buck's Row, Whitechapel. John Davies, living on top floor of 29 Hanbury Street, stumbled across it on the morning of Friday, August 31st, and yelled for the police. At a spot a very few hundred yards from where the mangled body of the poor woman Nichols was found just a week before, lay this body of another woman, mutilated and horribly disfigured. She was found at 5:30 on Sunday morning, lying in the backyard of No. 20 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, a house occupied by Mr. Richardson, a packing case-maker. As late as 5 o'clock on Saturday morning, it is said, the woman was drinking in a public house near at hand, called the 10 Bells. Near the body was discovered a rough piece of iron sharpened like a knife. The wounds upon the poor woman were more fearful than those found upon the body of the woman Nichols, who was buried on Thursday. The throat was cut in a most horrible manner, and the stomach terribly mutilated. The bowels were ripped open. The intestines hung out. The place was a pool of blood. While Davies cried for the police, Mrs. Richardson, an old lady sleeping on the first floor front, was aroused by her grandson, Charles Cooksley, who looked out of one of the back windows and screamed that there was a dead body on the corner. Mrs. Richardson's description makes this murder even more horrible than any of its predecessors. The victim was lying on her back, with her legs outstretched. Her throat was cut from ear to ear. Her clothes were pushed up above her waist and her legs bare. The abdomen was exposed, the woman having been ripped up from groin to breastbone, as in the preceding cases. Not only this, but the viscera had been pulled out and scattered in all directions, the heart and liver being placed behind her head, and the remainder along her side. No more horrible sight ever met a human eye, for she was covered with blood and lying in a pool of it. The throat had been cut open in a fearful manner, so deep in fact, that the murderer, evidently thinking that he had severed the head from the body, tied a handkerchief around it so as to keep it on. There was no blood on the clothes. Hanbury Street is a long street which runs from Baker's Row to Commercial Street. It consists partly of shops and partly of private houses. In the house in question, in the front room on the ground floor, Mr. Harderman carries on the business of a seller of cat's meat. At the back of the premises are those of Mr. Richardson, who is a packing case-maker. The other occupants of the house are lodgers. One of the lodgers, named Robert Thompson, who is a carman, went out of the house at 3:30 in the morning, but heard no noise. Two girls, who also live in the house, were talking in the passage until 12:30 with young men, and it is believed that they were the last occupants of the house to retire to rest. It seems that the crime was committed soon after 5. At that hour the woman and the man, who in all probability was her murderer, were seen drinking together in the Bells, Brick Lane. But though the murder was committed at this late hour, the murderer, acting, as in the other case, silently and stealthily, managed to make his escape. On the wall, near where the body was found, there was, according to one reporter, discovered written in chalk, 5, 15 more, and then I give myself up. Jack, the Ripper. Davies, the lodger, who discovered the body, immediately communicated with the police at the Commercial Street station, and Inspector Chandler and several constables arrived on the scene in a short time, when they found the woman in the condition described. An excited crowd gathered in front of Mrs. Richardson's house, and also around the mortuary in Old Montague Street, to which place the body was quickly removed. Several persons who were lodging in the house and who were seen in the vicinity when the body was found were taken to the Commercial Street station and closely examined, especially the women last with the deceased. Inquiries led to the discovery that the woman was known by several names. Her real name was Annie Chapman, but she had latterly passed as Annie Seavey, and rejoiced in the nickname of Dark Annie. Her age was about 45. She was 5 feet high, had fair brown wavy hair, blue eyes, and like Mary Ann Nichols, had 2 teeth missing. One peculiarity of her features was a large, flat kind of nose. Her clothing was old and dirty, and nothing was found in her pockets except part of an envelope bearing the seal of the Sussex Regiment. For the last 9 months she had been sleeping at a lodging house, 35 Dorset Street, Spitalfields, and she was there as recently as 2 o'clock on Saturday morning eating some potatoes. She had not, however, the money to pay for her bed, and at 2 o'clock she left with the remark to the keeper of the place, "I'll soon be back again. I'll soon get money for my doss." Almost the very words Mary Ann Nichols used to the companion she met in Whitechapel Road at 2:30 on the morning of her death. A companion identified her soon after she had been taken to the mortuary as Dark Annie, and as she came from the mortuary gate, bitterly crying, said between her tears, "I knowed her. I kissed her poor cold face." The large, flat kind of nose of the deceased was so striking a peculiarity that the police hoped to be able to fully trace the movements of the deceased by means of it. The clothing of the dead woman, like that of most of her class who ply their trade in this quarter of London, was old and dirty. In the dress of the dead woman 2 farthings were found, so brightly polished as to lead to the belief that they were intended to be passed as half sovereigns, and it is probable that they were given to her by the murderer as an inducement for her to accompany him. Late on Saturday, after the deceased had been formally identified as Annie Seavey, a witness came forward and stated that her real name was Annie Chapman. She came from Windsor and had friends residing at Vauxhall. She had been married, her husband being an army pensioner, who had allowed her 10 shillings a week, but he died a 12-month ago, and the pension ceasing, she became one of the hideous women infesting Whitechapel. She lived for a time with a sieve maker in Dorset Street, and was known to her acquaintances as Annie Seavey, a nickname derived from her paramour's trade. Mrs. Fiddymont, wife of the proprietor of the Prince Albert public house, better known as the Clean House, at the corner of Brushfield and Stewart Streets, half a mile from the scene of the murder, told police that at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning she was standing in the bar talking with another woman, a friend, in the first compartment. Suddenly came into the middle compartment a man whose rough appearance frightened her. He had a brown stiff hat, a dark coat, and no waistcoat. He came in with his hat down over his eyes, and with his face partly concealed, asked for a half pint of ale. She drew the ale, and meanwhile looked at him through the mirror at the back of the bar. As soon as he saw the woman in the other compartment watching him, he turned his back, and got the partition between himself and her. The thing that struck Mrs. Fiddymont particularly was the fact that there were blood spots on the back of his right hand. This, taken in connection with his appearance, caused her uneasiness. She also noticed that his shirt was torn. As soon as he had drank the ale, which he swallowed at a gulp, he went out. Her friend went out also to watch the man. Her friend was Mary Chapel, who lives at No. 28 Stewart Street, near by. Her story corroborates Mrs. Fiddymont's. When the man came in, the expression of his eyes caught her attention. His look was so startling and terrifying. It frightened Mrs. Fiddymont so that she requested her to stay. He wore a light blue check shirt, which was torn badly, into rags, in fact, on the right shoulder. There was a narrow streak of blood under his right ear, parallel with the edge of his shirt. There was also dried blood between the fingers of his hand. When he went out, she slipped out the other door and watched him as he went toward Bishopsgate Street. She called Joseph Taylor's attention to him, and he followed him. Taylor is a builder at No. 22 Stewart Street, and said that as soon as his attention was attracted to the man he followed him. He walked rapidly and came alongside him, but did not speak to him. The man was rather thin, about 5 feet 8 inches high, and apparently between 40 and 50 years of age. He had a shabby, genteel look, pepper and salt trousers, which fitted badly, and dark coat. When Taylor came alongside him, the man glanced at him, and Taylor's description of the look was, "His eyes were as wild as a hawk's." Was this man with the sharp eye also the man with the sharp knife? Was he the Whitechapel murderer? Time perhaps will tell. Jack, the Ripper, had got to be a thing of flesh and blood in the households of England. The man of Whitechapel inspired the fear once inspired by Guy Fawkes. Mothers hushed their unruly children by saying, "Be quiet, or Jack the Ripper will come." The police were still at work. The officials of Scotland Yard were more than usually busy. A cordon of constables surrounded Whitechapel. Bloodhounds were called into use and sniffed the dirty pavements. The women of the quarter did without food and drink, dared not venture into the streets. Every man they saw seemed to them the demon. Every man loomed up as Jack the Ripper, the fiend who would be satisfied with no less than 15 victims. It was on Sunday, September 23rd, a calm, quiet, autumnal day of rest. The churches and cathedrals of England were full of devout worshippers. Suddenly there flashed across the wires that a murder had been committed at Gateshead, near Newcastle on Tyne, in the north of England. Again a feeling of apprehension seized all classes. A young woman, disemboweled, mangled, mutilated, unrecognizable, lay cold in death on the roadside. Who did the dastardly deed? Everything pointed to the conclusion that this murder at Gateshead was the fell stroke of Jack the Ripper of Whitechapel, his 5th murder. The epidemic of fear in London now became more horrible than before. The most callous elegants of the West End now became thoroughly alarmed. But Jack the Ripper merely grinned with fiendish glee and kept from the sleuth hounds of the public. He hadn't killed his 15 yet. On the night of September 30th, the streets of London were echoing with shrieks of murder. 2 more unfortunate women had been added to the list of the butchered in Whitechapel, being the 6th and 7th victims. Elizabeth Stride, nicknamed Hippy Lip Annie, 40 years of age, was found murdered in Berners Street at 1 o'clock in the morning. Her throat was cut, but there was no slashing of the remains. The body was warm when found, and the murderer had evidently been frightened away. Now, 15 minutes after the discovery of the dead body of Hippy Lip Annie, the mutilated body of another victim, a degraded woman of the Whitechapel district named Catherine Eddowes, was found in the northeast corner of Mitre Square. The older portion of London abounds with these cul-de-sacs, inaccessible to wagons, and to be reached only by footpaths through private property. A stranger in London would never think of entering one of them, but the old Londoner knows them well as convenient short-cuts. There were 2 street lamps in Mitre Square, and they were burning brightly at 1 o'clock this morning. A large tea-house in the square hires a private watchman, and he was on duty last night, with lights blazing from 5 windows. He is a veteran policeman, and looks like a wide-awake, trustworthy man. Less than 200 feet from the tea-house are 3 or 4 dwelling houses, with bedroom windows facing the square, and at least 20 people sleeping in them. The policeman on the beat goes through the square every 15 minutes throughout the night, searching corners with a dark lantern, and rousing out homeless people who fall asleep on the area railings. The policeman who was on the beat at 1 o'clock this morning was a stalwart, honest-looking fellow. At 1:30 this morning he passed through the square, searching all corners with his lantern, and stopping for at least half a minute in one particular corner right under the bedroom window of a dwelling house. Everything was silent and dark, except the windows of the tea-house, where the watchman was awake, reading. 15 minutes afterward the policeman passed the same corner again. This time he found a woman stretched dead upon the pavement in a pool of blood, her throat cut, her nose torn from the face, the clothes thrown back over the body, the abdomen gashed into pieces, and the intestines wrenched from the stomach. The policeman started. He ran over to the tea-house and hammered on the door. "What's the matter?" shouted the watchman. "For God's sake," said the policeman, "come out and assist me. Another woman has been ripped open." Not a sound had the watchman heard. The slumbers of the people in the dwelling houses had not been disturbed. Within 15 minutes a merciless murder had been committed, and the murderer had disappeared in the darkness without the slightest clue for the police to follow. It was a horrible sight. Every sweep of the assassin's knife had been made to tell. It was a woman about 45 years old, poorly nourished, shabbily dressed, undoubtedly an unfortunate who picked up a living on the streets. In this case no organs were missing, as in the bodies of the women previously murdered. The cuts on the stomach were almost in the shape of the letter T, the upward cut stretching from the uterus to the breast, and a cross cut slanting from the lower part of the left ribs to the right hip. The deed must have been done with a heavy knife, and by someone skilled in the use of it. No jagged hacking, but clean cuts, scientifically made. Several doctors arrived and examined the body. They found a prodigious quantity of blood, which had flowed chiefly from the throat, but the murderer had so carefully avoided it that not a single footmark could be traced. The body was removed to the mortuary, where a careful post-mortem examination took place. There was a tattoo mark of a figure 4 on the woman's left forearm. Throngs of noisy men, dissolute women and squalid children surrounded the localities where the murders were committed and the places where the bodies await the coroner. They struggled and fought with each other to gain admittance to the dead house, and the police had to use brute force to drive them back. It was a panic of fear and frenzy that those who witnessed will never forget. Early in the day people were allowed in the dead house to see the woman found on Berner Street and to try and identify her. As soon as she was identified, the doors were closed to all except persons having business there. Those living in the neighborhood who did get a chance to approach the corpse paraded the streets all day with bloodstains of the victim on their fingers and described the appearance of the body over and over again to all the people who would listen to them. London was now thoroughly alarmed. Sir Charles Warren issued a proclamation. The Lord Mayor offered a big reward for the capture of the murderer. Even the swell in the West End stopped sucking the end of his cane, and showed considerable animation over the horror that took place with such startling successive rapidity. Everybody felt that the condition of the lost women in London ought to be investigated. Everybody felt there was much rottenness in the existing state of things. Is it a wonder there are so many degraded women in London? If the West End is full of iniquity and injustice, can you marvel at dissipation and debauch in the East End? London was soon stirred by another sensation. On October 2nd, 1888, the highly decomposed remains of a woman were found on the site of the projected Metropolitan Opera House on the Thames Embankment. The spot is near Charing Cross, 3 miles west of Whitechapel. But the state of the body, the gashes, the mutilations, the cuts, the holes in the flesh, proved plainly that the murderer was the old fiend, that this was his 8th victim. He had evidently attacked his victim from behind, cut her throat from ear to ear, dug his knife into her breasts. Then he raised her poor, dishevelled clothing, slit the body right and left the intestines exposed in a clotted pool of blood. There had evidently been a hard fight. Spots of gore were splattered all over the pavement. But the victim, in spite of her struggles, had succumbed to the hellish adroitness and diabolical strength of her foul assailant. There she lay in the moonlight, stiff, stark dead, and the murderer escaped. Newsboys hawked about the dreadful news. London at its breakfast read of a new tragedy. The calls for the resignation of Sir Charles Warren, Chief of Metropolitan Police, already loud, grow louder. Old men told the story of crimes in the olden times. Terrible as this eighth murder was, Whitechapel had been the scene of mysterious murders before. Close upon 80 years since it, and indeed the whole country, was startled by the perpetration of a series of most revolting murders, the scene being Ratcliffe Highway. The malefactor, whoever he was, for it was never definitely decided, although there was a case of strong circumstantial evidence, almost amounting to certainty, against an Irish sailor named Williams or Murphy, did not, in these instances, seek out and mark down unfortunate women of the lowest class, but looked for his victims in the persons of respectable tradespeople and their families, slaughtered without mercy every human being within the four walls, sparing not even the defenceless innocent babe in the cradle. The two distinct crimes, in which 7 lives were taken, occurred within the space of a fortnight. The first, the murder of the whole household of the Marrs, at No. 29 Ratcliffe Highway, soon after midnight of Saturday, December 8, 1811, and the second a similar massacre of the Williamsons, at No. 81 New Gravel Lane, Ratcliffe Highway, between 11 and 12 o'clock on the night of the 19th of the same month. In the first case 4 persons in all were the victims of the outrage. They were Mr. and Mrs. Marr, each of whom were under 25 years of age, their infant 4 months old, and James Gohen, the apprentice, 14 years of age. The servant girl would doubtless have shared the same fate but that she had been sent out on an errand, and on her return, having been absent less than 20 minutes, found the house in darkness, and subsequently the bodies were discovered lying in various parts of the ground floor and upon the staircase. 3 persons perished in the second case. They were Mr. and Mrs. Williamson, the landlord and landlady of the King's Arms, and their maidservant, who was found in like manner at the bottom front of the house. A delirium and panic seized Londoners in general, and those living in the East End especially, as had seldom or never been known before. People barricaded their doors and windows as if in momentary expectation of a siege, and there were some who even died of fright as they heard their shutters or doors tried by persons who, at the worst, were probably meditating nothing more serious than burglary. Nor was the alarm confined to the metropolis. A notion had somehow got abroad that the murderer, whoever he was, had left London, and a state of the wildest terror prevailed all over the country. It is an ill wind that blows nobody good, and those were fine times for locksmiths, ironmongers, carpenters, and the like. Everybody was having new shutters, doors, bolts, bars, and locks. Indeed, the door chain, which upon old doors is so often of tremendous strength and weight, owes its origin to the prevailing alarm which existed. For many months afterward he would be in truth a bold, and his neighbours would say, a rash man who answered a knock at the door or a ring at the bell before peering cautiously through the slit which the chain permitted. Even the caricaturists of the day, ready enough as a rule to seize hold of anything which excited the public mind, seemed to have been too frightened to make capital out of the murders, and the political cartoons which introduced hammers and razors, the instruments with which the crimes were committed, are but 1 or 2. Then, as now, in this particular district, the shopkeepers were in the habit of keeping open until midnight, and later on Saturday, and Mr. Marr, who was described as a man mercer, or a hosier, as the modern term has it, at a few minutes before 12, his shop still being open, gave his servant Margaret Jewell a £1 note instructing her to pay the baker's bill, and to bring in some oysters, which was no doubt a Saturday night, or Sunday morning, to be more accurate, treat after the labours of the week. Margaret went to the baker's, and finding it shut, returned past the shop, which was yet open, and her master was still behind the counter. She then went to get the oysters, but finding the shop shut up also, returned, after a brief absence of 20 minutes in all, finding the shop closed and everything in darkness. Upon knocking she was unable to gain admittance. Presently a watchman passed on the other side of the street with a person in charge, and soon after another watchman came up, calling the hour of 1, who told her to move on. She explained who she was, and the watchman knocked and rang, and then was joined by a neighbor, who got in through the back and opened the door, when they together entered the house. This was the girl's evidence at the inquest, and at this point she fainted away. A sorry spectacle met their gaze as soon as a light could be procured. There lay the apprentice upon his face on the staircase, with a great hole in his skull where his brains had been knocked out, and with such force had this been done, that portions thereof were bespattered over the walls and ceiling. Mrs. Marr was next found lying on the floor, near the street door, quite dead, her head wounded in a like terrible manner. And Mr. Marr's body, without any sign of life, was discovered behind the counter with exactly similar injuries. The only other occupant of the house, an infant 4 months old, whose innocence had not been sufficient to protect it, was in its cradle, with its throat cut from ear to ear. Its head lay almost severed from its body. Nothing was missing from the house, although there were £152 in the cash box, and the ill-fated Marr had nearly £5 in his pockets. The assassin, whoever he was, had disappeared, leaving behind him a large shipwright mallet, which was covered in blood, weighing 2 or 3 pounds, with a handle 3 feet long, a ripping chisel 18 inches long, and a wooden mallet about 4 inches square, with a handle 18 inches in length. Mr. Murray, the neighbor, stated that at about 10 minutes past 12 he heard a noise in Marr's house, like the pushing of a chair, and the watchman said that soon after 12 he had called out that the window was unfastened, and had been answered from within. "We know it." The girl gave evidence that while she was waiting she heard a child cry, and then someone came downstairs. Prints of blood-stained footsteps of at least 2 persons were, it was said, discovered in the rear of the premises, and several people were taken up on suspicion, but were discharged. The churchwardens of the parish offered a reward of £50, and this was supplemented by £20 from the Thames Police Office. But nothing came of it. Whilst London was ringing with the news, the terror which already existed was heightened by the intelligence of a crime which was equally barbarous and almost equally inexplicable. The unfortunate sufferers by the first outrage were buried in the presence of a large number of people on the Sunday following, and on the Thursday after, the 12th night from their death. The entire household of Williamsons, with one exception, was slaughtered, as already stated. On that night between 11 and 12, the passers-by in New Gravel Lane were alarmed by a cry of "Murder!" which came from a man clothed in nothing but his shirt, who was hanging by the sheets of his bed, which he had knotted together, from a second-floor window at No. 81 in that thoroughfare. He contrived to reach the ground, and then told those who had hurried upon hearing his cry of "Murder!" that murderers were in the house, slaughtering everyone within. A couple of men thereupon burst open the door, when they found the mistress and maidservant lying by the kitchen fire with their throats cut from ear to ear. In the cellar was the master of the house also, with his head nearly severed from his body, and one of his legs broken. The grandchild of the murdered man, a little girl, was happily found alive, but there were evidences that the murderer had entered the room, doubtless with the intention of slaying it also, for he was eventually shown pretty clearly to have been the Marr murderer, and no doubt his fiendish instincts were equally strong on each occasion. The noise of the breaking door and the persons entering the house, however, prevented his carrying his diabolical purpose into effect. Rushing upstairs, the crowd found the door of a room locked. As they burst it open, they heard the crash of glass. The murderer had sprung through the window, and in the fog which prevailed was lost to sight. Then the man in the shirt found an opportunity to speak. It appeared that he was a lodger in the house and had gone to bed, but was awoke by a cry of "We shall be murdered!" Out of bed he sprang, and looking over the stairs saw through the window of the tap room a powerful, well-made man, 6 feet high, dressed in drab, shaggy bearskin coat, stooping over the body of Mrs. Williamson, rifling her pockets. Then upon his terrified ears came the sounds of the sighs of a person in the agonies of death. Frightened half out of his life, he ran to the top of the house, but could not find the trap-door whereby to escape. Then he crept back to his room and escaped, as stated, through the window. Rewards were now offered amounting to £1,500, and a great number of persons were taken up on suspicion. Amongst them was a John Williams, or Murphy, for he went by either name, an Irish sailor, lodging at the Pear Tree public house, not far off. The wallet which had been left behind was marked with the initials J.P., and a wallet so marked was missing from a tool chest which had been felled at the Pear Tree by John Peterson, a ship's carpenter. Mr. Vermilye, the landlord, who was at the time of the murders in Newgate for debt, was shown the wallet. Murphy's washerwoman stated that there was blood on a shirt and some on stockings he had sent to her. More than one person had seen him near Williamson's house on the night of the murder, and others proved that he was well acquainted with both Marr and Williamson. Then, with that fatal stupidity that so often characterizes the guilty, Murphy, when told on Friday morning of the murder, and being yet in bed, replied surlily, "I know it." In his dreams, too, he had muttered words sufficient to implicate him, and so he was apprehended on the same day and committed for trial on the Saturday, a strong escort being provided to guard him on his way to Coldbath Fields Prison. Nor was the caution ill judged. All along the route he was attended by a howling, roaring mob, anxious to tear him limb from limb, and hurl his quivering flesh to the four winds. Escort and prisoner were only too thankful to get safely to the prison. Murphy managed, however, to cheat the hangman, and 2 days after Christmas his lifeless body was discovered hanging by his handkerchief from the iron grating of his cell. In accordance with the barbarous custom of the period, the suicide was buried in the dead of night at 4 crossroads, with a stake driven through his body. Not many months ago, Messrs. Aird and Lucas, workmen, digging a trench for the purpose of laying a main for the Commercial Gas Company at a point where the Cannon Street Road and Cable Street in St. George's in the East intersect one another, discovered a skeleton, supposed to be that of Murphy, with a stake driven through it, and some portions of a chain were lying close to the bones. The death of Murphy did not do much toward allaying the public panic. A general notion prevailed that he had been assisted by accomplices, and 2 of his friends, named Albras and Hart, were apprehended. But after several examinations they were discharged. The excitement took a long time to subside, but eventually the occurrences faded out of recollection, and now, with the exception of the journals of the period, there's nothing to keep alive their memory but the innocent door chain, with which not 1 in 100 of the modern jerry-built villas is furnished. Such is the yarn that old people in London tell young people of famous murders in Whitechapel. Meanwhile, though the old mystery was solved, the new is as deep and dire an enigma as ever. Dorset Street is one of the narrowest, dirtiest little alleys of all those that go to make up the labyrinth known as the East End of London. To get there a cabman had to ask questions, a rare thing, while his passengers on the journey loses all idea of location, and wonders whether the cab's horse's head or tail is pointing toward the north. Until today, only a few out of many million landowners knew that Dorset Street in the East End existed, but they know it now, and will, with all other Englishmen, talk about it for weeks. On the day of the Lord Mayor's show, November 9th, all interest was taken from that senseless pageant by ragged boys struggling through the crowds with bundles of newspapers, and yelling that another horrible Whitechapel murder had occurred in Dorset Street. You have read about these Whitechapel murders, and you know how the cutting up of some wretched woman is a happening which the average Britisher has come to look for as one of the regular incidents of metropolitan life. It has got to such a point that those murders can almost be written up after the methodical fashion which characterizes the minutes of some school board meeting. Each time a miserable creature belonging to the most degraded class of women is mutilated in a most inconceivably horrible fashion, the murderer has disappeared. The police do nothing but observe secrecy. The general public theorizes as to whether the murderer is mad or sane, short or tall, English or foreign, etc. The Whitechapel women shiver in bunches, wondering whose turn will come next, and after a while the terror in the East End and the curiosity in the West End subside together until a fresh murder renews them. The last and 9th Whitechapel murder was not committed in Dorset Street, properly speaking. Out of Dorset Street there opens an arched passage, low and narrow. A big man walking through it would bend his head and turn sideways to keep his shoulders from rubbing against the dirty bricks. At the end of the passage is a high court, not 10 feet broad and 30 long, thickly whitewashed all round, for sanitary reasons, to a height of 10 feet. That is Miller Court. Misery is written all over the place. The worst kind of London misery, such as those who have lived their lives in America can have no idea of. The first door at the end, on the right of the passage, opens into a tiny, damp room on level with the pavement. The landlord of this and neighbouring rooms is a John McCarthy, who keeps a little shop on Dorset Street on the side of the passage. About a year ago he rented it to a woman who looked about 30. She was popular among the females of the neighbourhood, who shared her beer generously, as I've been tearfully informed, and went under the title of Mary Jane McCarthy. Her landlord knew that she had another name, Kelly, but her friends had not heard of it. It seems there had been a Mr. Kelly, whom Mary Jane had married in the manner which is considered satisfactory in Whitechapel. They had not gone to the expense of a license, but published the fact of matrimony by living in one small room, and sharing joy and sorrow and drunkenness there together. Mary Jane took up her residence in the little room in Miller Court when Kelly went away. Since then her life had been that of all the women around her, her drunkenness and the number of strange men she brought to her little room being the gauges by which her sisters in wretchedness measured her prosperity. On November 8th she went out as usual, and was seen at various times up to 11:30 drinking at various low beer shops in Commercial Street. In those resorts she was known not as Mary Jane, her own name, but as Fair Emma, a title bestowed in complimentary allusion to her appearance. At last, just before midnight, she went home with some man who appears to have dissuaded her from making a good night visit, as was her custom, at the drinking place nearest her room. No description whatever can be obtained of this man. Right opposite the passage leading to Mary Jane's room is a big and very pretentious lodging house, where the charge is 4d. Some gentlemen congregated about the door at midnight are sure they saw a man and a woman, the latter being Mary Jane, stop to laugh at a poster on one side of the passage, which offers £100 reward for the Whitechapel murderer. The man must have enjoyed the joke, for he himself was the Whitechapel murderer beyond all doubt. This picture from real life of a murderer reading an advertised reward for his capture with the woman he was about to butcher is not a usual one. A great deal of speculation will be done as to whether he was a cold-blooded monster trembling at his own danger as he read, or a madman, defiant of everything and with difficulty restraining his impulse to kill at once. The men who saw him can only say that he did not look remarkable. At 10 o'clock in the morning, just as the Lord Mayor was climbing into his golden carriage, 3 horrified policemen, who had first looked in through Mary Jane's window and then drunk big glasses of brandy to steady themselves, were breaking in her door with a pickaxe. The Whitechapel murderer had done his work with more horrible thoroughness than ever before. The miserable woman's body was literally scattered all over her little room. A description of such butchery is unpleasant to write, but it is necessary to understand London's state of terror and to form an opinion as to this remarkable murder. Almost every conceivable mutilation has been practiced on the body. McCarthy, the shopkeeper and landlord, had seen the body first. He had gone, as he had daily for a long time past, to ask for several weeks' arrears of rent, amounting in all to 30 shillings. Though not an imaginative man, McCarthy at once expressed the conviction that a devil, and not a man, had been at work. This, by the way, is a new theory in regard to the murderer's identity. The woman's nose was cut off, and her face gashed. She had been completely disemboweled, as had all the murderer's former victims, and all the intestines had been placed upon a little table which, with a chair and the bed, constituted all the furniture in the room. Both the woman's breasts had been removed and placed also on the table. Large portions of the thighs had been cut away, and the head was almost completely severed from the body. One leg was almost completely cut off. The mutilation was so frightful that more than an hour was spent by the doctors in endeavouring to reconstruct the woman's body from the pieces, so as to place it in a coffin and have it photographed. On the 8th of November, at midnight, Dorset Street and all the neighbourhood was swarming with such a degraded Whitechapel throng as have already been described in these columns. Those with any money were getting drunk very fast. The drunkenness of the poor of London is amazing. Many sober women, and all the drunken ones, were crying from terror, while the men lounged about, singing or fighting, and chaffing the women, according to their ideas of humour. Gallantry is not rampant among these Whitechapel men. The police were doing nothing of importance. The woman's poor fragments, put together as skilfully as possible, were lying in the Houndsditch mortuary, in a scratched and dirty shell of a coffin often used before. The mortuary is in a graveyard back of the gloomy old Houndsditch church, and not a pleasant spot late at night. While the body was being carried from the scene of the murder, thousands crowded as near as the police would allow, and gazed with lifted caps and pitying faces at the latest victim. The police did nothing but push the crowd about and be officious. This to such an extent that even those whose duty led them to the place found it necessary to place frequent softening half-crowns in policemen's palms. The most interesting individual in Miller Court was a woman who had known the dead woman. Mary Jane's pal, she called herself. Her room was directly opposite the murdered woman's, and its agitated proprietor stood in the doorway, urging a young girl with straggling wisps of red hair, who had started for beer, not to be gone a minute. She assured a reporter that she would be glad to talk to him while Kate was away, just to forget the horrors. This woman spoke well of the dead. Her name was Mary. She had not always been on peaceable terms with the murdered Mary Jane. Though quarrelsome, Mary Jane was pretty before she was cut up, she said, and she was only 24, not 30, as she looked, but she would fight, and did not care what sort of place she lived in. Mary's was about as big as a horse car. Sleeping and cooking were both done in it. On a clothesline stretched across it a nightdress was drying. There was a bed 1 foot above the floor, a stool and a nondescript piece of furniture to hold things. There was milk in a saucer on the floor, showing that vile air and worse drainage had brought the kitten down without the help of hunger. When the girl with the red hair came back, the woman who had been a friend of Mary Jane drank in a few minutes a quart of beer, relating at the same time many incidents in the lives of herself and her dead friend. At last, with a flood of drunken tears, she declared that she would never dare go out on the streets again to earn a living, observed somewhat inconsistently that lightning never struck twice in the same place, meaning that the murderer would never come back to Miller Court, made the red-haired girl swear an oath to stay all night, and went to sleep on the bed with her head the wrong way up. Those who think they have a working plan for reforming society should take a careful look through Whitechapel and see the things they have got to reform. The girl with the red hair did not think it wonderful that no one had heard any sound of the murder. Someone was always drunk and yelling in Miller Court, and she rightly guessed that a woman being beaten would make as much noise as one cut up, so that the murder would not be noticed. For her part, she was sure to imagine murder in every direction now. She had a strong mind, however, had not had any beer, and did not cry. She knew positively that Mary Jane was alive at 1 o'clock, and for that hour she had heard her singing "Sweet Violets" to whoever was in her room. This fact and the name of the tune has been solemnly entered in the police account of the case. It is useless to theorize any further concerning the murderer. He proved himself a man of wonderfully cool nerve or most utter recklessness. There is little prospect of anything resulting from the English detectives' efforts. London has resigned itself to wait till the murderer shall betray himself. The question faces us: who was the man who committed these harrowing murders? Many explanations have been given. "A suicidal maniac," says one. "A crank afflicted with insane desire for notoriety," says another. "A man who has been injured in some mysterious way by a woman of the unfortunate class, and who thus wreaks his vengeance." One of the most palpable explanations given as to the identity of the murderer was that advanced by John Paul Bocock in the New York World, ascribing the murders to Nicholas Vassili, a Russian, who committed a series of murders in Paris some years ago, and who, according to the journalist, now repeats his fell work in London. Here is the story of Vassili's crimes. Even if he should not prove to be the Whitechapel murderer, the story is interesting. No stronger story of love, crime, fanaticism, and mania has ever been told. The ferocious stamp of a savage realism marks the history of Nicholas Vassili from the first as that of a man unfettered from human restriction, a law, a creed, a passion unto himself. He was born in 1847 at Tiraspol in the province of Kherson. At that time a religious reform was just beginning to stir from the time-worn ruts of their creed, the peasantry and middle classes of southern Russia. Nicholas grew up to feel its influence to the depth of his strange nature. He grew up to be a tall, stern youth, broad shoulders, strong beyond the common power of his peers, dark-eyed, pale-faced. His family were well-to-do. He did not have to work, but studied, pondered, and came before his majority an ascetic in body as in mind. At the beginning of the year 1872, the Russian Church made a vigorous effort to repress the spread of this fanatical asceticism in Kherson, of which Vassili was now a leading exponent, and which seemed to be running havoc among the peasantry and middle classes. The sect of which he was the rising apostle was that of the Shorn. When the Russian patriarchs began to persecute them, some of the Shorn were for a resort to arms. Others went into voluntary exile, and among the latter was Nicholas Vassili. He was now 25 years of age, and a notable-looking man in any assemblage. He had been well educated at Tiraspol and at the University at Odessa, and he had inherited from his parents an income sufficient to his own frugal needs. So fierce had been his denunciations of the oppressors of the Shorn, so vindictive his asceticism, that he had already come to be recognized as the young leader of this peculiar sect of the proscribed. Through him was crystallized and commanded for rigid discipline and observance of the main dogma, the cardinal principle of the creed of the Shorn, which was the total abnegation of all fleshy, especially sexual, pleasures. To this creed he deemed it his duty to convert the world. He gladly went into banishment, since it gave him the opportunity to make proselytes. The strength of his zeal had eaten up his human affiliations. He was no longer able to agree with even his fellow sectmen. He went to Paris and made himself known through letters of introduction to several members of the Russian colony there. He did not desire new friends among them, but the opportunity through them of becoming acquainted with the city, with the people, and with the cocottes. He had already devoted himself to the salvation of Les Emperdés. He was now der Seelenwetter. In a month or two his new Russian friends saw him no more. He could now find his way about alone. He took bachelor lodgings in Rue Mouffetard. Here his tall, lean, brawny form, his pale, waxy face, his burning black eyes, soon attracted attention. He got to be known as an enigma. Amid piles of books he worked away all day, and when night came went out into the streets to wander about until dawn. His new mission was big within him, but he had not yet revealed it. Often his concierge would find him in the morning bent over his study table, where she had left him the evening before. By and by people began to talk of the Saviour of the lost souls. He would be seen in the bright light of a cafe entrance, beneath the street lamps in the slums, at the edge of a dim cul-de-sac, wherever the nymphs du pavé congregated or could be found by painstaking search, pleading with them, weeping over them, exhorting them to repent, lead a new life, save their souls, and join the sect of the Shorn. From entreaty he passed on to malediction, and he would, in strange burning words and with uncouth gestures, draw pictures of the perdition to which they were hastening, and from which he begged them to permit him to save them. Where they showed a sincere interest in his words, and promised to try to reform, he gave them money from his own purse, but his hopes for their reformation were uniformly disappointed. A few nights would elapse, and the same painted faces and mocking eyes he had pleaded with, and he thought, partially reformed, would present themselves to him under the gaslight and laugh at the handsome gutter preacher. Whether they had cried or fled frightened, or only laughed at his earnest exhortations, the result was the same. He was unable to reform them. He next made the acquaintance of a young lady who worked in a lace-making establishment. Finally he realized that he, the leader of the Shorn, had fallen in love. Then he tried to reconcile faith with passion, and besought Madeleine to become of his sect, to renounce the world and live for the conversion of her fellow sinners. She might even become his wife, in a spiritual sense only, and live and work with him. She demurred, he coaxed, then he threatened, and carried his point. But no woman was ever won by threats, and half ashamed of his own violence, Nicholas kept away from Madeleine for 3 days. He had never kissed her. Only a hand clasp had sanctified the betrothal. The 4th day he went to the apartment he engaged for her in the Rue Serrurier. The door was locked. When he had knocked violently, Madame Guida, half frightened, opened her own door and asked him what was the matter. "I don't know. Where is Madeleine?" was all he could stammer out. His face was frightfully distorted with a terrible presentiment. "Madeleine went away," Madame Guida replied, "the day you were last here. She said you and she had got a home of your own. Did she deceive me?" Nicholas said nothing to this, but demanded that the apartment be opened. "You see," went on Madame Guida, "she removed only a part of her wardrobe. She said you would come and take the remainder away for her." Vasili fell into a chair and groaned. Leaping up like a madman, he forced open the little desk he had given Madeleine, and ransacking its drawers, finally found what he had suspected, a note in Madeleine's handwriting, addressed to himself. He stuffed her other letters into his pockets and sat down and read out to Madame Guida Madeleine's last words, which made a fiend of him. "I thank you 1,000 times for all your kindness. I respect but cannot love you. I am grateful, but why should I sacrifice my life to my gratitude? That which brought us together separates us. You saved me, but you ought not to ask me as a reward. I cannot reconcile your roles of gutter preacher and lover. Forgive me and forget me." From that time on Nicholas gave up his proselyting, and devoted his nights to a search for Madeleine. His dagger in his bosom warmed his heart and promised him revenge for her scorn. The only woman he had ever loved could not betray him with impunity. After 8 weeks he found her where he had first seen her, in the Rue Richelieu. Without a word he stabbed her in the back. She fell at his feet with a scream. He rushed off, mumbling, "She is saved forever. She is sure of heaven. She can sin no more now." Then the gutter preacher disappeared. The Parisian police looked for him in vain. A few days afterwards a cocotte was found in a quiet street of Faubourg Saint Germain, stabbed from behind, dead and mutilated. 3 days later another was found, wallowing in blood, with the same wounds, in the Quartier Mouffetardne. Tremendous excitement followed the discovery. In a week another was found hacked and slaughtered in the same way. Their money, purse, jewels, etc., were intact in all cases. A panic such as that now in Whitechapel followed among the fallen women of Paris. Nicholas, as he afterwards confessed, killed 5 of them in 14 days. On the night of the arrondissement of the Pantheon a dark figure crept up behind a young girl, stabbed her, and started to fly. As she fell she turned and shrieked out, so that the police heard her, "Nicholas Vassili!" Then she died in Nicholas's arms, for he too had recognized her too late. He was seized, dragged to prison, and tried for murder. His lawyer got him a 15-year sentence on the ground of insanity. He confessed his murders to the jury, and told them of his mission on earth. He regretted that he had not killed Madeleine when he first stabbed her, and when he left her, as he supposed, dying at his feet. The bloody monster was released from the asylum in Tiraspol on January 1, 1888. He was on his way to London when last seen in January. The Whitechapel murders began in April 1888. Meanwhile, Jack the Ripper still lurks undiscovered. After the 9th murder he sent out the following letter. "Dear Boss, it is no good for you to look for me in London, because I'm not there. Don't trouble yourself about me till I return, which will not be very long. I like the work too well to leave it long. Oh, that was such a jolly job, the last one. I had plenty of time to do it properly. The next lot I mean to do with a vengeance, to cut off their heads and arms. You think it is a man with a black moustache. When I have done another you can catch me. So goodbye, dear Boss, till I return. Yours, Jack the Ripper." If he were the creature of a romance on the stage, the one immortalized by Stevenson as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the murder of Whitechapel could not play his double game to more diabolical effect.